Walking through that imposing oak entrance, I realized I was about to make either the most brilliant choice of my existence or commit the most catastrophic error possible. Victoria Sterling's expression contorted into something resembling both a grin and a scowl, as though she'd just tasted something sour while attempting to smile for a camera. Her gaze swept over my understated black dress, my simple shoes, my drugstore jewelry, and I observed her mentally assessing my financial standing and concluding I was worthless. She leaned closer to her son, my boyfriend David, and murmured something she assumed I couldn't detect. But every syllable reached my ears. She declared I resembled the domestic staff who had mistakenly entered through the wrong door. That's precisely when I understood this dinner would prove extremely fascinating. My name is Sophia Chen. I'm 32 years old, and I have a revelation to share. For the previous 14 months, I've been concealing something significant from the man I was planning to wed. Not some trivial secret like consuming the final slice of cake and blaming the cat. Not some moderate secret like still sleeping with a childhood stuffed toy. No, my secret was that I earn $41,000 monthly. Before taxes, the figure becomes even more shocking. After taxes, it remains the type of amount that makes financial advisors pause and wonder if there's been an error. I serve as a principal software architect at one of the most prominent technology corporations on the West Coast. I've been programming since age 15, sold my initial application at 22, and have been ascending the corporate hierarchy ever since. I possess 3 patents. I've presented at global conferences. I hold stock options that would astonish you. And David believed I was an administrative clerk who could barely manage her monthly expenses. I never actually deceived him. When we encountered each other at a cafe 14 months earlier, he inquired about my profession, and I responded that I worked in technology. He nodded as if he comprehended, then asked whether I managed scheduling for company executives. I smiled and mentioned something vague about supporting the team. He drew his own conclusions, and I simply never corrected his assumptions. Why would I behave in such a manner? Why would I allow the man I was dating, the man I was developing feelings for, to believe I was financially struggling when I could have purchased his vehicle 10 times over? Because I discovered something long ago from the most significant person in my existence. My grandmother raised me after my parents died when I was 7. She resided in a humble home in a peaceful neighborhood, operated an older vehicle, shopped at regular markets, and never wore anything ostentatious. She taught me to prepare simple dishes, to value small joys, and to never measure my worth by the digits in my financial account. What I didn't realize until she passed when I was 24 was that my grandmother was worth several $1,000,000. She had constructed a modest business empire in her youth, invested shrewdly, and chosen to live modestly because she believed that character was more significant than appearance. She bequeathed me everything, along with a letter that I still keep in my bedside drawer. In that letter, she wrote something I've never forgotten. She said that a person's genuine character only emerges when they believe no one significant is observing, when they think you have nothing valuable to offer them, when they consider you beneath their attention. That's when you witness who they truly are. So, when David invited me to dinner at his parents' mansion, when he suggested that this might be the evening when things became serious, when he mentioned that his mother was extremely particular about initial impressions, I reached a decision. I would subject the Sterling family to the examination my grandmother had taught me. I would appear as the simple, unassuming woman they anticipated. I would wear modest clothing and drive my old car and speak humbly about my circumstances. And I would observe how they treated someone they believed couldn't assist them, someone they thought was inferior to them, someone they thought had nothing to contribute. And before you criticize me, before you think I was being manipulative or dishonest, let me pose a question. Have you ever wondered what your partner's family genuinely thinks of you? Have you ever experienced that persistent feeling that the smiles are artificial and the compliments are empty? Have you ever wanted to discover the truth, even if it might cause pain? I wanted to know. I needed to understand because I wasn't simply considering marrying David. I was considering joining his family. And families, as my grandmother also taught me, are permanent. Now, before I continue with this account, I just want to pause briefly. If you're enjoying this story so far, would you please hit that like button and leave a comment telling me your location and the current time there? I absolutely love reading those comments, seeing people from across the globe tuning in at various hours. It means more to me than you realize. All right, back to the narrative. The Sterling estate was exactly what I anticipated, and somehow still managed to surprise me with its extravagance. The driveway alone exceeded the length of some streets I've resided on. The gates were wrought iron with golden details, because apparently regular iron wasn't pretentious enough. The lawn was groomed with the kind of precision that suggested someone measured each blade of grass individually. As I drove my 12-year-old Honda Civic up that immaculate driveway, I glimpsed myself in the rearview mirror. Minimal makeup, hair secured in a simple bun, my grandmother's small pearl earrings, the only jewelry I wore. I looked exactly like someone who didn't belong there. Perfect. David met me at the entrance with a kiss that felt somewhat theatrical, like he was performing for an audience. His eyes glanced at my dress, my shoes, my absence of accessories, and I detected something in his expression that I had never noticed before. Shame. He was ashamed of my appearance. I stored that observation for later consideration. Inside, the house was a shrine to new wealth desperately attempting to appear like old money. Crystal light fixtures suspended from every ceiling. Oil paintings in ornate frames decorated the walls, though I noticed they were reproductions, not originals. The furniture was expensive, but appeared uncomfortable, selected for aesthetics rather than practicality. And there, standing in the foyer like a monarch surveying her domain, was Victoria Sterling. She was in her early 60s, with the type of face that had clearly encountered several skilled surgeons. Her platinum hair was styled in a perfect helmet that probably required professional-grade hairspray to maintain. Her dress was designer, her jewelry was authentic, and her smile was absolutely, completely false. She extended her hand to me as if she were granting an audience. I shook it, and felt the weakness, the dismissal, the complete absence of warmth. Then she made that remark to David, the one about me resembling the help, and I smiled and pretended I hadn't heard anything. The evening was about to become very interesting indeed. If I had known what I was entering that night, I might have worn protective gear instead of a black dress. But then again, I've always believed that the best protection is knowledge, and I had conducted my research. The Sterling family owned a network of automobile dealerships spanning 3 states. Not the flashy luxury brands you see in films, but respectable mid-range vehicles that appealed to average families. David's father, Robert, had inherited the business from his own father and had spent the last 30 years expanding it. Victoria had married into the family at 23 and had immediately begun climbing the social ladder with the determination of a woman who knew exactly what she desired. They had 2 children. David, my boyfriend, was 34 and worked as a marketing director at a company unrelated to the family business. This was apparently a contentious issue with Robert, who had expected his son to assume control of the dealerships. And then there was Charlotte, the older sister, who was 38 and treated the family fortune like her personal treasury. I had discovered all of this through public records, social media, and several well-placed internet searches. I had seen photographs of elaborate parties, society events, and charity galas. I had read articles about Victoria's philanthropy, though closer examination revealed that most of her donations came with substantial tax advantages and publicity opportunities. None of this had prepared me for meeting Charlotte in person. She arrived 20 minutes late, which I would later learn was her signature approach. Making an entrance was more important than respecting other people's time. She swept into the living room wearing a dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary, with diamonds cascading from her ears and neck, like she had tumbled into a jewelry store and emerged covered in merchandise. Her greeting to me was a single word, delivered with the warmth of ice. Hello? Not hello, nice to meet you. Not hello, David has told us so much about you. Just hello, with a slight curl of the lip that suggested she had detected something unpleasant. I smiled and said hello back. She turned to her mother and began a conversation that pointedly excluded me, discussing some charity event and whether the florist had been dismissed yet for last month's disaster. I stood there holding the glass of water I had been offered, feeling about as welcome as a vegetarian at a barbecue. David hovered nearby, looking uncomfortable, but saying nothing. That was the second observation I filed away. Robert Sterling was a different creature altogether. He was a large man, the type who had probably been athletic in his youth, but had since surrendered to the comforts of wealth. He shook my hand with a grip that was meant to be impressive, but just felt weary. His eyes were cunning, though, and I noticed him watching me with something that might have been curiosity. There was another guest at this dinner, someone I hadn't expected. An older gentleman named Thomas Mitchell, who was introduced as an old family friend and business associate. He was in his late 60s with silver hair and keen eyes that seemed to miss nothing. When he shook my hand, his gaze lingered on my face with a flicker of recognition that puzzled me. Did I know him? Had we met somewhere before? I couldn't place him, and he didn't say anything. But throughout the evening, I would catch him staring at me with that same confused expression. Victoria led us into the dining room, which was decorated like someone had been given an unlimited budget and zero taste. The table was long enough to host a state dinner. The chairs were upholstered in what I assumed was genuine silk, and the place settings included more forks than I had ever seen outside of a restaurant supply store. I counted them. There were 6 forks at each place setting, 6 for a single meal. I've seen medical procedures performed with fewer instruments. Victoria noticed me examining the silverware and smiled. That frozen smile of hers. She said she assumed I wasn't familiar with formal dining, her voice dripping with false sympathy. I said that my grandmother always taught me that it's not the utensils that matter, but the company you share the meal with. Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Charlotte snorted into her wineglass, and dinner commenced. The first course was some type of soup that I couldn't identify, but probably cost more per bowl than my weekly grocery budget. Victoria used this time to begin what I would later think of as the interrogation. She asked where I had grown up. I said a small town in Washington, which was true. She asked about my family. I said my grandmother had raised me, which was also true. She asked what my parents did. I said they had passed when I was young. Victoria made a sound that was supposed to be sympathetic, but came out sounding like a drain clearing. She said how challenging that must have been growing up without proper guidance. I said my grandmother provided all the guidance I ever needed. Charlotte leaned forward, her diamonds catching the light from the chandelier overhead. She asked what my grandmother had done for a living. I said she had been a businesswoman. Charlotte's eyebrows rose slightly. She asked what kind of business. I said small enterprises. Nothing too exciting. The truth, of course, was that my grandmother had built a company that she eventually sold for several $1,000,000. But that wasn't the type of truth that would serve my purpose tonight. Victoria moved on to the next topic. She asked about my current job. I said I worked in technology. She asked if I was a secretary. I said I was more of a support role. Victoria nodded knowingly as if this confirmed everything she had already decided about me. She said that was nice, that every team needed support staff. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but still said nothing. And that's when Charlotte decided to bring up Isabella. Isabella. The name dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water, sending ripples across the table. Charlotte said the name so casually, as if she were mentioning the weather or the quality of the soup. She said she had encountered Isabella last week, that she was doing wonderfully, that her family's business was thriving. I watched David's face carefully. Something flickered there, quickly hidden. Guilt. Nervousness. It was gone before I could identify it. Victoria picked up the thread with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for this opportunity. She said Isabella had always been such a lovely girl, so accomplished, so well suited to their family's lifestyle. She had been David's girlfriend for 3 years. Did I know that? I said I didn't. Victoria smiled. She said it was such a shame when they had parted ways. Everyone had expected them to end up together. Isabella's family owned an import company that dealt in luxury vehicles, which would have been such a perfect match for the Sterling dealerships. The implication was clear. Isabella had been the right choice. I was not. I looked around the dining room and noticed for the first time that there were photographs on the wall behind me. I turned slightly in my chair and saw a gallery of family moments. Christmases, birthdays, graduations, and in at least 4 of those photographs, a beautiful brunette woman stood next to David, her arm linked through his, her smile radiant. Isabella. Victoria followed my gaze and said nothing, but her satisfaction was almost tangible. Charlotte twisted the knife a little deeper. She said Isabella was still single. Actually, such a surprise that no one had claimed her yet, almost like she was waiting for something or someone. I turned back to the table and smiled. I said she sounded like a remarkable woman. This was clearly not the response Charlotte had expected. She blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Victoria recovered first. She said yes, Isabella was remarkable. And then, with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, she added that she hoped I wouldn't feel too out of place in their world, given my more humble background. I asked what she meant by humble. Victoria's smile grew teeth. She said she understood that not everyone was born into certain advantages, that some people had to work ordinary jobs and live ordinary lives, that there was no shame in being mediocre. Mediocre. She had called me mediocre. I felt something shift inside me, but I kept my expression neutral. I had come here to learn the truth about these people, and the truth was becoming very clear indeed. David finally spoke up. He said his mother didn't mean anything by that she was just being protective of him. Victoria patted his hand and said of course she was protective. A mother always wants the best for her son. The unspoken conclusion hung in the air like smoke. And you are not the best. Robert cleared his throat and attempted to change the subject. He asked about my hobbies, whether I had any interests outside of work. I said I enjoyed reading, hiking, cooking simple meals, nothing fancy. Charlotte laughed and said that was adorable, like a child listing their favorite activities. Thomas, the family friend, spoke for the first time since we'd sat down. He said he thought there was something to be said for simple pleasures, that his own grandmother had lived a modest life and been the happiest person he had ever known. Victoria shot him a look that could have soured milk. Thomas ignored her and continued looking at me with that strange, searching expression. He asked what my grandmother's name had been. I said Eleanor Chen. Thomas's eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing more, just nodded thoughtfully, and returned his attention to his soup. The rest of dinner continued in much the same way. Victoria and Charlotte took turns asking questions designed to remind me of my place, which in their minds was somewhere far beneath them. David occasionally made weak attempts to defend me, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. Robert stayed mostly silent, watching the proceedings with the tired resignation of a man who had learned long ago that arguing with his wife was pointless. And through it all, Thomas watched me. By the time dessert arrived, I had learned everything I needed to know about the Sterling family. They were snobs of the highest order, the kind who measured human worth in dollars and social connections. They saw me as an obstacle to be removed, a problem to be solved, a mistake David had made that needed correcting. But I had also learned something else, something I hadn't expected. David was not the man I had thought he was. The David I had fallen in love with was kind and attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in me as a person. But this David, the one who sat at his mother's table and let her tear me apart without a word of real protest, was someone different, someone weaker, someone who cared more about his family's approval than about defending the woman he claimed to love. I wondered which one was the real David. I was about to find out. After dessert, Victoria announced that we would have coffee in the sitting room. The men drifted toward the windows to discuss business, while Charlotte excused herself to make a phone call. Victoria said she needed to speak with the housekeeper about something, and would join us in a moment. This left me alone with my thoughts, and a perfect opportunity. I excused myself to find the restroom. David pointed me toward the back of the house, down a long corridor lined with more pretentious artwork. I walked slowly, taking in the details. The house was impressive from a purely financial standpoint, but it felt cold, empty, like a museum that no one actually lived in. The restroom was easy to find, but I wasn't really looking for it. What I was looking for was information, understanding, some clue that would help me make sense of the evening. I found something much better. As I walked past a partially open door, I heard voices, Victoria's voice and Charlotte's. I stopped. Every instinct told me to keep walking, to respect their privacy, to not eavesdrop like a character in a soap opera. But something in Victoria's tone made me pause. Something sharp, urgent. I moved closer to the door, staying in the shadows. Victoria was saying that they needed to deal with this situation quickly, that David couldn't be allowed to make this mistake. Charlotte agreed. She said she couldn't believe he had actually brought me here, that she had thought this was just a phase, like his vegetarian period in college. Victoria said this was more serious than a diet. This woman could ruin everything. I felt my heart beating faster. They were talking about me. Of course, they were talking about me. But what came next was what really made my blood run cold. Charlotte said the timing couldn't be worse. She said they needed the merger with the Romano family to go through, and David needed to be with Isabella for that to happen. Romano. That was Isabella's family name, the luxury car importers. Victoria agreed. She said the dealership was in trouble, that they needed the Romano partnership to survive the next fiscal year. I felt the floor shift beneath me. The Sterling dealerships were in financial trouble. I had suspected something from my research, but this confirmed it. Charlotte continued. She said David was supposed to keep Isabella interested while they worked out the details. That was the plan. Isabella's family would invest in the dealerships, and in return, they would get access to the Sterling distribution network. Victoria said David had assured her that he was keeping his options open with Isabella. Options open, while he was proposing to me. I leaned against the wall, my mind racing. This wasn't just snobbery. This wasn't just a family who didn't like their son's girlfriend. This was calculated, strategic. David wasn't just a weak man who couldn't stand up to his mother. David was using me. But for what? Why keep me around if Isabella was always the plan? Charlotte answered my unspoken question. She said David was such a fool. He actually seemed to like this little secretary, this nobody. He was supposed to use me as a placeholder until the deal with Isabella was finalized. But he was getting attached. A placeholder. That's what I was. A placeholder. A distraction. Someone to keep David occupied while the family worked out their business arrangements. Victoria said they would handle it. She said they would make the engagement announcement tonight, get David publicly committed to this girl, and then find a way to break them up before the wedding. Once they had Isabella secured, they would discover some terrible secret about me that would justify ending the engagement. Charlotte asked what terrible secret. Victoria said they would invent one if necessary. I stood in that hallway, frozen, listening to two women plan the destruction of my relationship like they were planning a dinner party. And then Charlotte said something that made everything even worse. She said at least the girl was too stupid to suspect anything, that David had picked well in that regard. She was naive, trusting, probably just grateful that someone like David had noticed her at all. Victoria laughed and agreed. I stepped back from the door, moving silently down the hallway. My hands were shaking, but not with hurt, with anger. They thought I was stupid. They thought I was naive. They thought I was so desperate for love that I would accept whatever crumbs they threw my way. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I found the restroom, splashed some cold water on my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was not broken. She was not devastated. She was thinking. I had come here tonight to test David's family, and they had failed spectacularly. But the test had revealed something I hadn't expected. David himself was part of the problem. He wasn't just caught between me and his family. He was actively deceiving me. The question now was what to do about it. I could confront him. I could walk out there right now and tell everyone exactly what I had heard. I could create a scene, expose their plans, and leave this house forever. But that would be too easy, too quick. They would dismiss me as emotional, dramatic, bitter. They would tell themselves that I was just proving their point about me. No, if I was going to respond to this betrayal, I would do it my way, on my terms, with a plan that they would never see coming. My grandmother had taught me many things, but one lesson stood above all others. She said that when someone underestimates you, they have given you a gift, the gift of surprise. Victoria and Charlotte had just given me the greatest gift of all. They had no idea what I was capable of. I fixed my makeup, smoothed my hair, and walked back to the sitting room with a smile on my face. The game was just beginning. When I returned to the sitting room, something had changed. The furniture had been rearranged slightly, the lighting adjusted. Victoria was standing by the fireplace with a look of barely concealed anticipation. Robert had positioned himself near the doorway, looking uncomfortable. Charlotte was pretending to examine a painting, but I caught her glancing at David with a smirk, and David was standing in the center of the room, looking nervous. Too nervous. He turned when I entered, and his face broke into what was supposed to be a loving smile. He walked toward me, took my hands in his, and said he wanted to ask me something. I felt the trap closing around me. David said that he knew we hadn't been together very long, and that his family could be a little overwhelming at first, but he said he knew what he wanted. He said he wanted me, and then he got down on one knee. The ring he produced was large and flashy, exactly the kind of thing Victoria would approve of. It was also, I noticed immediately, of questionable quality. The diamond was cloudy, the setting uneven. It was the kind of ring that looked impressive in dim lighting, but would reveal its flaws in the harsh light of day, much like the man holding it. David asked me to marry him. Behind him, Victoria was beaming. This was clearly the plan, the first step in their strategy. Get David publicly committed to me, then find a way to dispose of me later. In the meantime, they would use the engagement to keep Isabella waiting, dangling the promise of David while they worked out their business arrangements. I understood all of this in the space of a heartbeat. I also understood that I had a choice to make. I could say no. I could reject this proposal from a man who was using me, in front of a family who despised me. I could walk out with my dignity intact and never see any of them again. But that would end the story too soon. I thought about what I had heard in the hallway. I thought about their plans to invent some scandal about me. I thought about how they saw me as stupid, naive, disposable, and I thought about how satisfying it would be to show them exactly how wrong they were. So I said yes. David slipped the ring on my finger, and Victoria began clapping like she was at a theater performance. Charlotte offered her congratulations with all the warmth of a January morning in Antarctica. Robert shook David's hand and told him he had done well. Thomas caught my eye from across the room. There was something in his expression, something knowing, like he suspected that this story had a few more chapters to go. I smiled at him, and he smiled back. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of champagne and false congratulations. Victoria talked about engagement party planning. Charlotte discussed venues. Robert mentioned business opportunities that might arise from the union of our families, though he stumbled over this, clearly unsure what my family could possibly bring to the table. David stayed close to me, playing the role of devoted fiancé with surprising conviction. If I hadn't heard what his mother and sister had said, I might have believed it. But I had heard, and I would never forget. When the evening finally ended, David walked me to my car. The night air was cold and clear, and for a moment, we just stood there in the driveway, looking at each other. He asked if I was okay. He said he knew his family could be a lot, but he promised they would warm up to me eventually. I said I understood. I said I was just tired. He kissed me goodnight, and I drove away from the Sterling estate with his ring on my finger and a plan forming in my mind. The next morning, I started my research. If there's one thing my job has taught me, it's the power of information. Data, documentation. I spend my days analyzing systems, finding weaknesses, optimizing solutions. I was about to apply those same skills to the Sterling family, and what I found over the next few days confirmed everything I had heard, and then some. The Sterling dealerships were indeed in financial trouble. Not just a rough patch, but serious structural problems. They had expanded too quickly during the boom years, taken on too much debt, and now the bills were coming due. Their main franchise agreement was up for renewal, and the manufacturer was looking at other options. The partnership with Isabella's family wasn't just strategic, it was desperate. But that wasn't all. As I dug deeper, I found something else. Something that the Sterlings probably thought was hidden forever. Charlotte had been embezzling from the family business. The amounts were small at first, hidden in expense reports and petty cash accounts. But over the years, they had added up. Hundreds of thousands of dollars siphoned off to fund her lifestyle while the company struggled. I printed out everything I found: legal documents, financial statements, records of suspicious transactions. And then I started making phone calls. My grandmother's name still carried weight in certain circles. The business contacts she had cultivated over decades remembered the Chen family with respect. When I reached out, they were happy to talk. One of those contacts happened to know Thomas Mitchell. And Thomas, it turned out, had his own history with the Sterling family. They had cheated him on a business deal years ago. Nothing illegal, just unethical enough to leave a bitter taste. He had been waiting for an opportunity to even the score. I was about to give him that opportunity. Before we continue, I just want to say something from my heart. This channel means so much to me. And every single like, every comment, every subscription helps more than you know. If you're enjoying this story, would you please take just 2 seconds to hit that subscribe button? It really makes a difference. Thank you. Now, back to what happened next. The next few weeks were an exercise in patience and performance. I played the role of the happy fiancé with the skill of an award-winning actress. I attended family dinners at the Sterling estate. I listened to Victoria's passive-aggressive comments with a smile. I watched Charlotte flaunt her designer clothes and expensive jewelry, knowing exactly where the money had come from. And I watched David. He was different now. Or maybe I was just seeing him clearly for the first time. The attentiveness I had once found charming now seemed calculated. The compliments felt rehearsed. And his phone, which he guarded with increasing vigilance, buzzed with messages that he quickly hid from view. I knew who was texting him. I had seen the name flash across his screen more than once. Isabella. One evening, I told David I was working late. Instead, I parked near the restaurant where he was supposed to be meeting a client. He wasn't meeting a client. He was meeting her. I watched through the window as they sat together at a corner table, their heads close together, their body language unmistakably intimate. At one point, he took her hand across the table. At another, she laughed at something he said and touched his face. I took photographs, not because I needed evidence for any legal purpose, but because I wanted to remember this moment. I wanted to remember exactly who David Sterling really was. He wasn't just weak. He wasn't just a mama's boy. He was a liar and a cheat, actively maintaining 2 relationships while his family orchestrated the outcome from behind the scenes. The rage I felt in that moment was white-hot and purifying. But I didn't act on it. Not yet. Instead, I went home and added the photographs to my growing file. Thomas and I had been meeting regularly, always in secret. He had his own documentation of the Sterlings' questionable business practices. He knew people who had been hurt by their dealings over the years. He was more than willing to help bring them down. But he asked me why. He said he understood his own motivations, but he wanted to know mine. Was this just about revenge? Or was it something more? I thought about his question for a long time before I answered. I said it wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. I said the Sterlings had spent their lives using their money and position to manipulate people. They treated anyone they deemed beneath them as disposable. They were raising David to be the same way, and they would keep doing it to others long after I was gone. I said someone needed to show them that their money couldn't protect them from consequences. Thomas nodded slowly. He said my grandmother would be proud. That was the moment I knew I had made the right choice. The engagement party was set for 3 weeks later. The Sterlings were hosting it at their estate, inviting everyone who mattered in the business community. Victoria was treating it like a coronation, an opportunity to show off her perfect family to the world. She had no idea what was coming. I spent those 3 weeks preparing. I coordinated with Thomas. I made strategic calls to industry contacts. I even reached out to the car manufacturer that was considering dropping the Sterling dealerships. They were very interested in what I had to share. And then, the night before the party, I did one last thing. I gave David one final chance to be honest. We were sitting in his apartment, going over last-minute details for the party. I asked him casually how he felt about us, about our future. He said he was excited. He said he couldn't wait to marry me. I asked if there was anything he wanted to tell me. Anything at all. He looked at me with those blue eyes that I had once found so charming. He said there was nothing. He said I was everything he had ever wanted. I asked about Isabella. His face went pale. He recovered quickly, but I had seen the flash of fear in his eyes. He said Isabella was just an old friend. Nothing more. I nodded and said I understood. And in that moment, I did understand. I understood that David would never tell me the truth. He would lie to my face for as long as it served his purposes. He was his mother's son through and through. The next evening, I put on a dress from my real closet. Not the modest black number I had worn to that first dinner. This was designer, elegant, worth more than everything Victoria was wearing combined. I looked at myself in the mirror and smiled. It was time to show the Sterling family exactly who they had underestimated. The Sterling estate had been transformed for the engagement party. White tents dotted the manicured lawn. Crystal chandeliers hung from temporary structures, casting prismatic light across the gathering crowd. A string quartet played tasteful classical music near the fountain. Waiters in crisp uniforms circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more per bite than some people's hourly wage. Victoria had outdone herself. This wasn't just a party. This was a statement. I pulled up in my usual Honda, watching the valet's expressions as they tried to reconcile my modest vehicle with the parade of luxury cars that had preceded me. One of them actually asked if I was with the catering company. I smiled and handed him my keys. The walk from the parking area to the main tent felt like a runway. With every step, I shed the persona I had been wearing for the past 3 weeks. The nervous girlfriend, the grateful fiancé, the simple woman who should be thankful for Victoria Sterling's grudging acceptance. Tonight, I was Sophia Chen, the real one. My dress was a deep sapphire blue, custom-fitted by a designer whose name was whispered in fashion circles with reverence. My jewelry was understated but unmistakable to anyone who knew quality. My grandmother's emerald pendant hung at my throat, a piece that had been appraised at more than most cars cost. My watch was a limited edition that only 50 people in the world owned. I had spent the past 14 months hiding who I was. Tonight, I would stop hiding. The first person to notice me was a woman I didn't recognize. Someone's wife or girlfriend standing near the entrance to the main tent. She looked at me, did a double take, and then whispered something to her companion. They both stared. I kept walking. The second person to notice was Robert Sterling. He was greeting guests near the bar, performing his duties as host with the tired enthusiasm of a man who would rather be watching sports. When he saw me, his welcoming smile froze in place. His eyes traveled from my face to my dress to my jewelry and back again, and I watched confusion replace his practiced hospitality. I said good evening and thanked him for hosting such a lovely party. He stammered something about being glad I could make it, his eyes still trying to solve the puzzle I presented. I moved on before he could ask any questions. The main tent was filled with perhaps 100 guests, a carefully curated collection of business associates, society figures, and family friends. I recognized some faces from my research. The regional manager from the car manufacturer, several competing dealership owners, a journalist from the local business publication. And there, holding court near the champagne fountain, was Victoria Sterling. She was wearing a cream-colored gown that had probably cost a small fortune, though it was clearly off the rack despite her best efforts to suggest otherwise. Her jewelry was impressive by normal standards, but unremarkable by the standards of true wealth. She was laughing at something one of her guests had said, her head thrown back in that practiced way that suggested she had learned to fake amusement at finishing school. She hadn't seen me yet. I collected a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and made my way through the crowd, stopping to introduce myself to several guests along the way. Each interaction followed the same pattern. Confusion at my appearance. Surprise when I mentioned I was David's fiancé. Renewed confusion when my dress, my jewelry, my manner didn't match whatever they had been told about me. Word was spreading. I could see it in the whispers, the sidelong glances, the phones being subtly checked as people tried to figure out who I really was. Good. I finally reached Victoria's circle, just as she was finishing a story about her recent charity work. She turned to greet the newcomer with her standard frozen smile, and then her face went through a remarkable transformation. First confusion, then recognition, then disbelief, then something that might have been fear. She said my name like a question. I said, "Good evening, Victoria," and thanked her for throwing such a beautiful party. Her eyes were moving rapidly, taking in every detail of my appearance. The dress that cost more than her monthly household budget, the pendant that had been featured in a jewelry magazine, the watch that she had probably never seen outside of an advertisement. She asked where I had gotten these things, her voice carefully controlled, but unable to hide the tremor beneath. I said they were just a few pieces I had been saving for a special occasion. Charlotte appeared at her mother's side, summoned by some invisible distress signal. She looked at me, and her expression went through the same journey Victoria's had: confusion, recognition, disbelief. But Charlotte recovered faster. She said the dress was interesting, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She asked if it was a rental. I told her the designer's name. I said he was a friend who had made it specifically for me. The designer's name hit Charlotte like a physical blow. This was someone who dressed celebrities, who had a waiting list years long, who didn't make dresses for administrative assistants who could barely afford their rent. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. I excused myself to find David. As I walked away, I heard Victoria hiss something to Charlotte about finding out what was going on. I heard Charlotte's confused response, saying she had no idea, that this didn't make any sense. I smiled to myself and kept walking. The first phase of the evening was complete. The seed of doubt had been planted. Now it was time to let it grow. David found me before I found him. He emerged from a cluster of guests near the bar, his face pale and his eyes wide. He had clearly heard the whispers, seen the looks, tried to reconcile the woman standing before him with the woman he thought he knew. He asked what was going on. He asked where I had gotten the dress, the jewelry, the transformation. He asked why I looked like a completely different person. I said I looked like myself. He stared at me, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. Not understanding exactly, more like the first crack in a wall that had been hiding an uncomfortable truth. He asked if we could talk privately. I said later. I said this was our engagement party after all. We had guests to attend to. Before he could protest, I took his arm and steered him toward a group of business associates. These were the men and women who ran the automotive industry in our region, the people whose opinions actually mattered to the Sterling dealership's survival. They had been watching my entrance with undisguised curiosity. I introduced myself properly this time. I gave my full name, Sophia Chen, and mentioned my position at my company. I watched their expressions change as they recognized the company name, as they realized who I actually was. One of them, a silver-haired man who ran a competing dealership chain, said he had heard of me. He said his daughter worked in tech and had mentioned my name in connection with some innovative software solutions. I said that was very kind of him. Another guest, a woman who handled mergers and acquisitions for a major investment firm, asked if I was related to Eleanor Chen. I said she was my grandmother. The woman's eyebrows rose. She said my grandmother had been a remarkable businesswoman. She said the Chen name still carried significant weight in certain financial circles. I could feel David tensing beside me. He had no idea what any of this meant. He'd never asked about my family beyond the most superficial questions. He had assumed poor meant unimportant, and he had never bothered to look deeper. His mistake. The evening continued, and with each conversation, the truth spread further. People were talking, checking their phones, confirming details. The narrative was shifting beneath the Sterling's feet, and they didn't know how to stop it. Thomas arrived about an hour into the party. He found me near the rose garden, momentarily alone while David was pulled away by his father for some urgent conversation. Thomas said the manufacturer's representative was here. He said the man had been very interested in the documentation Thomas had shared with him earlier in the week. I asked if he was ready. Thomas said he had been ready for years. We talked for a few more minutes, finalizing the details of what would happen next. Then Thomas melted back into the crowd, and I returned to my role as the happy fiancé. Victoria found me next. She had regained some of her composure, though I could see the strain around her eyes. She pulled me aside with a grip that was stronger than necessary and demanded to know what I was doing. I asked what she meant. She said I knew exactly what she meant. She said the dress, the jewelry, the stories I was telling people about my grandmother and my job. She said she wanted to know what my game was. I said there was no game. I said I was simply being myself. She said that was impossible. She said David had told her about my circumstances. She said I was a secretary who lived in a studio apartment and drove a car that belonged in a junkyard. I said David had made certain assumptions. I said I had never actually told him those things. Victoria's face went very still. I said I worked in tech, which was true. I said I had a support role, which was also true since architects support the development teams. I said I had never claimed to be poor. I said I had simply never corrected their assumptions. She asked why. I looked at her directly. I said my grandmother taught me that a person's true character only shows when they think no one important is watching. I said I wanted to know who the Sterling family really was. I said now I knew. Before she could respond, the string quartet stopped playing. Robert Sterling's voice came over the speaker system, announcing that it was time for the official toasts and speeches. Victoria looked at me with something that might have been fear. I smiled and walked toward the stage. The main event was about to begin. The stage had been set up at the far end of the main tent, decorated with flowers and soft lighting that was probably meant to be romantic, but instead felt like a spotlight waiting for its moment. Robert stood at the microphone, welcoming guests and thanking them for coming to celebrate this special occasion. He talked about family, about tradition, about the importance of strong partnerships in both business and life. His eyes kept darting to Victoria, who was making her way through the crowd toward the stage with the determination of a general approaching a battlefield. She reached the microphone just as Robert was finishing his remarks. She took over smoothly, her composure firmly back in place, her smile as frozen and perfect as ever. She said she was so pleased to welcome everyone to this celebration of her son's engagement. She said David had found himself a wonderful young woman, someone who would be a perfect addition to the Sterling family. She said they had exciting plans for the future, plans that would ensure the Sterling legacy continued for generations to come. Then she began to hint at business opportunities. She talked about growth and expansion. She talked about new partnerships and strategic alliances. She talked about the Sterling dealerships entering an exciting new chapter. I watched the manufacturer's representative shift uncomfortably. I saw Thomas catch his eye and nod almost imperceptibly. Victoria was building toward something. She was using this engagement party as a platform for some kind of business announcement, probably related to the Romano merger that was supposed to save their company. She called David to the stage. He climbed the steps looking nervous, though he was trying to hide it behind his practiced smile. He stood beside his mother and looked out at the crowd, searching for me. His expression was complicated. Victoria said there was one more person who should be on this stage. She said she wanted to welcome her future daughter-in-law, the woman who had captured her son's heart. She said my name, and the crowd turned to look at me. I set down my champagne glass and walked toward the stage. The tent was silent except for my footsteps. Every eye was on me. The whispers had done their work. Everyone knew that something was happening, that this engagement party was about to become something else entirely. I climbed the steps and stood beside David. He reached for my hand, but his grip was uncertain, questioning. Victoria handed me the microphone with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said she was sure I wanted to say a few words. I looked at the microphone in my hand. I looked at David. I looked at Victoria, who thought she was in control. I looked at the crowd, filled with people who could make or break the Sterling family's future. I said yes, I did want to say a few words. And then I began to speak. I said I wanted to thank Victoria for the warm welcome she'd given me. I said I wanted to acknowledge the Sterling family for showing me exactly who they were over the past few weeks. Victoria's smile flickered. I said when I first came to this house, I made a decision. I decided to let the Sterlings see a simple version of me, a woman without expensive clothes or impressive credentials, a woman they might consider beneath their notice. The crowd was utterly silent. I said I wanted to see how they would treat someone they thought couldn't help them, someone they thought had nothing to offer, someone they thought was, in Victoria's words, mediocre. Victoria's face went white. I said what I had found was illuminating. I described the dinner where I had been compared unfavorably to my fiancé's ex-girlfriend. I described the whispered insults Victoria thought I couldn't hear. I described being called the help, being called mediocre, being called a gold digger by people who knew nothing about me. David was staring at me now, his face a mask of horror. I said then I heard something I wasn't supposed to hear. I described the conversation in the study. I described Charlotte and Victoria discussing how to remove me from David's life. I described learning that I was just a placeholder, someone to keep David occupied while the family arranged his real future with Isabella Romano. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I said I discovered that the Sterling dealerships were in serious financial trouble. I said I learned they were desperate for a merger with the Romano family to survive. I said I found out that David had been keeping his options open with Isabella the entire time we were together. I pulled out my phone and showed a photograph on the screen. David and Isabella at the restaurant, holding hands across the table. I said this was taken 2 weeks ago while David was supposedly working late. The crowd erupted in whispers. David grabbed my arm. He said this wasn't what it looked like. He said he could explain. I said he had already explained. I said I had given him the chance to be honest the night before, and he had chosen to lie. I turned back to the crowd. I said there was more. The tent had become completely silent again. Every person in that crowd understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. The comfortable rules of society events had been suspended. The masks were coming off. I said I had spent the past few weeks researching the Sterling family business. I said I had found some interesting things. I mentioned the financial records, the overextended credit, the declining sales, the franchise agreement that was about to be terminated. Robert Sterling's face had gone gray. I said I had also found evidence of something more serious. I looked directly at Charlotte, who was standing near the back of the tent, frozen in place like a deer caught in headlights. I said Charlotte Sterling had been embezzling from the family company for years. I said the amounts had started small, but had grown over time. I said the total was now in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Charlotte's husband turned to look at her with an expression of pure shock. Charlotte shouted that was a lie. She said I had no proof. She said I was just a bitter woman trying to destroy their family. Thomas stepped forward from the crowd. He said he had proof. He walked toward the stage carrying a folder that I knew contained years of documentation. Bank records, expense reports, transaction histories, everything needed to prove exactly what Charlotte had done. He handed the folder to the manufacturer's representative, who had moved closer to the stage with the look of a man whose worst suspicions were being confirmed. Thomas said he had been waiting a long time for this moment. He said the Sterlings had cheated him on a business deal 15 years ago, and he had never forgotten. He said when Sophia had approached him with evidence of their current misdeeds, he had been happy to contribute what he knew. Victoria found her voice. She said this was outrageous. She said we had no right to make these accusations. She said she would sue us for defamation. I said she was welcome to try. I said everything I had shared was documented and verifiable. I said the financial records were public information available to anyone who knew where to look. I said the evidence of Charlotte's embezzlement had been compiled from sources that would hold up in any court. I looked at David, who was still standing beside me, looking like a man whose entire world had collapsed. I said there was one more thing. I reached up and removed the engagement ring from my finger. The cloudy diamond caught the light, revealing all its flaws. I said I would not be marrying David Sterling. I said I had never intended to. Not after I learned the truth about him and his family. I said the only reason I had said yes to his proposal was to give them enough rope to hang themselves. I handed the ring back to David. I said he should give it to Isabella. I said she was clearly the one he actually wanted. David's face crumpled. He said that wasn't true. He said he had feelings for me. He said the thing with Isabella was just business, something his mother had arranged. I said that was exactly the problem. I said he had let his mother arrange his life, his relationships, his future. I said he had never once stood up for me when his family attacked me. I said he had lied to my face about Isabella, even when I gave him the chance to be honest. I said a man who couldn't be honest with the woman he claimed to love was not a man I wanted to marry. The crowd was absolutely silent. I turned to face them one final time. I said I was Sophia Chen. I said I was a senior software architect who had built a career through hard work and integrity. I said I made more money in a month than most people made in a year. I said I lived simply because my grandmother had taught me that wealth was not the measure of a person's worth. I said the Sterlings had shown me their true character. They had revealed themselves as people who judged others by their bank accounts and social status. They had treated me with contempt because they thought I had nothing to offer them. I said that was the kind of character that would eventually destroy them, with or without my help. I set the microphone down on the podium and walked off the stage. The crowd parted for me like water. No one spoke. No one tried to stop me. Behind me, I heard the chaos begin. I didn't look back as I walked through the tent, but I could hear everything. Victoria's voice, high and desperate, trying to salvage the situation. She was saying there had been a misunderstanding, that I was clearly disturbed, that none of what I had said was true. But the damage was done. I could hear the manufacturer's representative speaking into his phone, his voice clipped and professional. I could hear other guests murmuring, some already heading for the exits, wanting to distance themselves from the disaster unfolding before them. I reached the edge of the tent and paused. Charlotte had cornered her husband near the bar, trying to explain, trying to justify. His expression was stone. He was looking at her like he had never seen her before, like the woman he had married had been replaced by a stranger wearing her face. Robert was slumped in a chair, his head in his hands. The patriarch of the Sterling Empire, brought low by the exposure of secrets he had probably suspected, but never wanted to acknowledge. And David. David was standing alone on the stage, the rejected ring still clutched in his hand. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Anger, grief, regret. It didn't matter anymore. I walked out of the tent and into the cool night air. The stars were bright overhead, indifferent to the human drama playing out beneath them. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with air that felt cleaner, somehow lighter. Thomas found me by the fountain a few minutes later. He said it was done. He said the manufacturer had already made the call. The Sterling dealerships would lose their franchise agreement by the end of the month. I asked if he felt satisfied. He said satisfaction wasn't quite the right word. He said it felt more like relief, like a debt that had finally been paid. I understood what he meant. He asked what I would do now. I said I would go home. I said I would sleep well for the first time in weeks. I said I would wake up tomorrow and continue building the life I had created for myself. The life that had nothing to do with David Sterling or his family. Thomas nodded. He said my grandmother would have been proud of me tonight. I felt tears prick at my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. I said I hoped so. He handed me a business card. He said if I ever needed anything, I should call. He said he owed me one. I tucked the card into my purse and thanked him. Then I walked to the valet station, collected my old Honda from a very confused attendant, and drove away from the Sterling estate for the last time. In my rearview mirror, I could see guests streaming out of the tent, the party dissolving into chaos. I could see Victoria gesturing wildly, still trying to control a narrative that had slipped completely beyond her grasp. I turned my eyes back to the road and didn't look again. The drive home was quiet. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I just drove through the night, letting the miles put distance between me and everything that had happened. When I finally reached my modest apartment, I sat in the car for a long moment before going inside. I thought about David, about the man I had believed he was, and the man he had turned out to be. I thought about how close I had come to marrying him, to binding my life to his, to becoming part of a family that would have treated me with contempt forever. I thought about my grandmother and the lesson she had taught me about character and worth, and I thought about the future, my future, the one I would build for myself on my own terms with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could give them. I got out of the car and went inside. My apartment was small and simple, just the way I liked it. I made myself a cup of tea, changed out of my designer dress, and sat by the window in my old comfortable robe. The city lights sparkled below me, thousands of lives playing out in thousands of windows. I was just one of them, nothing special, nothing extraordinary, and that was exactly how I wanted it. 1 week later, I was sitting at my kitchen table with my morning coffee when my phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline read, "Sterling Automotive facing closure after franchise termination." I read the article slowly, absorbing the details. The manufacturer had officially ended their partnership with the Sterling dealerships, citing concerns about financial management and ethical practices. Without the franchise agreement, the dealerships couldn't sell new vehicles. Without new vehicle sales, the business couldn't survive. The article mentioned that several former business partners had come forward with their own complaints about the Sterling family's practices. It mentioned that an internal investigation had revealed financial irregularities that were now being reviewed by authorities. It mentioned that Charlotte Sterling had been asked to step down from her position in the company pending further inquiry. It did not mention me. I had asked Thomas to keep my name out of it, and he had honored that request. The story would be about the Sterlings' own misdeeds, not about the woman who had exposed them. I didn't want fame or recognition. I just wanted the truth to come out. And it had. I finished my coffee and looked around my small kitchen. The same kitchen I'd been sitting in a month ago when I'd first driven to the Sterling estate to meet David's family. The same kitchen where I'd made the decision to test them, to see who they really were beneath their polished surface. So much had changed since then, and so much had stayed exactly the same. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from David. He said he needed to see me. He said he could explain everything. He said he had made mistakes, but he still cared about me. He asked if we could meet for coffee, just to talk. I looked at the message for a long moment. Then I deleted it without responding. Some doors, once closed, should stay closed. I stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the morning sun rising over the city. It was going to be a beautiful day. A day for new beginnings, for moving forward, for building something better. My grandmother's pendant hung at my throat, warm against my skin. I touched it gently, thinking about the woman who had taught me everything I knew about character and worth. She had lived her life simply, not because she had to, but because she understood that the things that truly matter can't be bought. Love, integrity, self-respect, the knowledge that you have acted according to your principles, even when it would have been easier to compromise. The Sterlings had thought they could buy their way through life. They had believed that money and status made them better than everyone else, entitled to treat people however they wanted without consequences. They had been wrong. I turned away from the window and got ready for work. My regular job at my regular company, doing the work I loved with people who respected me for my skills and character, rather than my bank account. The story of the Sterling family would continue to unfold in the coming weeks and months. There would be investigations and legal proceedings. There would be consequences and repercussions. The empire they had built on a foundation of arrogance and deception would crumble piece by piece. But that was their story now, not mine. My story was just beginning, and it would be written on my own terms, in my own words, according to my own values. That was the lesson my grandmother had taught me. That was the truth I had carried with me through every moment of the past month. A person's worth isn't measured by their bank account or their social status or the opinions of people like Victoria Sterling. It's measured by their character, by the choices they make when no one is watching, by the way they treat people who can't do anything for them. The Sterlings had failed that test completely, and I had finally found the answer I had been looking for. The answer was that I didn't need their approval. I didn't need David's love. I didn't need anyone's validation to know my own worth. I already knew who I was, and that was enough.